Guys, watching these games yesterday, Championship Sunday, I was looking at the Niners, I was looking at the Bengals, and really specifically the Bengals for going out there and reaching the Super Bowl year two after year two with their quarterback, 2 years removed from being the worst team in the NFL at 2-14. But you really look at some of these teams around the league, including the Niners, who 3 years ago, they were 2-14, and they already reached the Super Bowl during this run. You don't get 4 to 5 years to rebuild your football team anymore. Really, if you look at the timeline for a rebuild in the NFL, at the most, it's 3 years. Like, if by year two, you're not infinitely more competitive, you might not have the right people. If by year three, you're not in the playoffs, you might not have the right people. And by people, I mean the two most important positions on a football team, head coach and quarterback. Like, the rebuild timeline to get to at least the playoffs, to me, is 2 to 3 years. Like, if you don't have the right coach, move on. If you don't have the right quarterback, move on. Like, if the Texans hire, let's say, Josh McCown, I don't want to hear from Nick Caserio that, we got to give him a couple of years here because he's got to learn on the job. He's got to learn how to be a really good coach because he's never done it before. Like, to me, that's nonsense, man. Like, obviously, there's going to be leeway no matter who you hire, but, like, there has to be an expectation level that you start to improve things, very quickly in the NFL because the days of getting, 4 to 5 years in a rebuild, those days are long over.
Honestly, it's harder to be the Browns and the Lions than to be the Niners and the Bengals. It's hard to be perennially bad. I know the Browns have gotten a little better over the last couple of years, but in terms of just being bad for decades on end, the NFL is set up to where it's harder to do that than to have the turnarounds that the Niners and Bengals have had over the last couple of seasons. Guys, I make this comparison all the time. The NFL is like a socialist country. Of course, you could still be poor in a socialist country, but they really make it hard to do that. They want to set everybody up to be successful. And the NFL does that with bad teams. They give bad teams the easiest schedule the following season. They obviously give bad teams higher draft picks the following season. If you play your cards right, if you make a couple of right moves, you can turn things around in this league. That's what they want, Cody. We see teams go from first to worst and worst to first all of the time in this league. So, yeah, if you play your cards right, if you bring in the right coach, the right quarterback, and make a couple of other accurate decisions, you can turn your team around in a very, very short amount of time, in a shorter amount of time than any other sport in the world.
Inherently, along the lines and playing off what BK just said, the NFL gives you the ability very quickly to be right around the middle of the pack. It's just how well did you take advantage of those opportunities to get you out of the middle of the pack, or how much did you fail on those opportunities to keep you down at the bottom of the NFL. I mean, look at the Bengals situation. They've spent some significant draft equity on that offensive line, and that thing stinks. It stinks to high heaven, but they nailed it with the QB. They nailed it with T. Higgins. They nailed it with Jamar Chase. They've filled in nicely over on the defensive side. They've had some guys from free agency that have worked out for them over the past couple of seasons. They've had some guys who are entering, year 3 or year 4 after they brought them in with the organization that are playing well, and they put it all together, and now they're in the Super Bowl. There's been teams that haven't nailed it with a variety of things. I mean, BK, you bring up the Browns. They were a little bit above what the middle class of the NFL was last season. This season, squarely in the middle class of the NFL. Squarely right there in the middle. You look at the Pittsburgh Steelers. They got horrible quarterback play this year. Squarely in the middle of the NFL. Now, they make the playoffs a little bit better than just the middle, but they give you a lot of weapons to get into the middle. The NFL does. It's how well do you execute that gets you out of the middle into the upper echelon.
And I'm not even saying that, the Texans need to be the Bengals or they need to be the Niners, who after they went 2-14, 3 years later after they hired Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch as their GM, they're in the Super Bowl. And then here they are years later in the playoffs in the NFC title game. But let's use the Buffalo Bills as an example. They had a 17-year playoff drought when Sean McDermott took over. He gets them into the playoffs. Year 2, they start a rebuild because they took Josh Allen, who struggled as a rookie. Year 2 with Allen, they're in the playoffs. Year 3, they're in the championship game. This year in year 4, you could argue they were the second best team in the AFC, but they came up, just short against Kansas City last week. It doesn't take that long. So I'm not sitting here saying the Texans need to be in the Super Bowl in a couple of years. But, we're not going to give Josh McCown or we're not going to give Jonathan Gannon or Brian Flores, 3 to 4 years to start this rebuild. You get 2 or 3 years max, and you better show us some progress. Because if you don't have the right coach, and you don't have the right quarterback, and you got to move on and start over, because trying to convince yourself someone's the guy when they're clearly not leaves you like you're the Vikings with Kirk Cousins, or leaves you with all these teams that are just stuck in like quarterback purgatory because they're not bad enough to get somebody new and they're not good enough to ever actually, make a run and go to a Super Bowl.
Especially when you think about the fact that the Houston Texans in this upcoming offseason are about to make a trade that's going to give them rebuild accelerators.
Yeah.
Like the Cincinnati Bengals have just picked their picks the past few seasons, and they got to where they are. It's not like the Bengals had an additional haul of first and second round picks that they got to add to the equation. I mean, the Texans are going to be in a situation where they haven't spent a ton of money. They don't have a lot of long-term financial commitments. The salary cap keeps going up. It jumped $20 million this offseason. It might jump another $20 million next year. The Texans, again, don't have long-term financial commitments. They're going to make this trade that is an accelerator to the rebuild, and that is part of the reason why the expectations are high. And look, I'm going to say a statement, and people may make fun of me when I say this, but this is not an organization that keeps the arrow pointing down in its history. In the 20-plus years the Texans have been around here, they've had 2 times where they've been bad back-to-back seasons. Like the arrow is almost always, it's not a quick climb a lot of times. It's oftentimes more steady, but the arrow is almost always pointed sideways or pointed up for the Houston Texans organization. And I have to imagine, God, I really hope that the owner of the team, Cal McNair, is seeing that, and he says, look, I've been around this thing. My dad owned this thing. We are never continuously bad. We cannot stay bad in the NFL. So what's going on here? I hope that he looks at that, and I hope that's the standard that Nick Caserio, the new coach, Jack Easterby, and everybody else is held to over there at NRG Stadium.
Well, you guys have hit on this, but just think of what the NFL does to try and increase parity, right? You have a schedule that rewards the bad teams by having a softer schedule the following season. You get higher draft picks based on where you finish. So your schedule is easier. You're compensated better in the draft. Like the NFL incentivizes basically every team in the league to try and be around 500.
That's what they want.
A team like the Bengals reaching the Super Bowl is a great thing for the NFL. Like the Bengals inspire hope for a lot of franchises, a lot of fans across the sport, because Cincinnati 2 years ago was the worst team in the NFL. Zach Taylor, their head coach, was 6-25-1 through 2 seasons. Most guys get fired after that, but they let him coach year 3. Joe Burrow takes off, and boom, they're in the Super Bowl. Not every team can find a Joe Burrow, but you could find a team like what the Niners did, where they're 2-14 3 years ago, but then they go out there and hire Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch, and they build it back up, have smart drafts, and yeah, they haven't won that championship yet, but they've been to the Super Bowl. Here they are again in the championship game. Like, if you got the right people in charge, the rebuild timeline, once again, it's not 4 to 5 years. It's 2 to 3 years, and if you're not competing by then, move on from the people you have in place.
You talked about it. The 2 most important hires are quarterback and head coach. You don't technically hire a quarterback, but you got to get that one right. You got to get the head coach right, and if you do, you can experience turnaround relatively quickly in the NFL. And look, Cody, I don't think any of us expect the Texans to be super competitive in 2022. That just feels unrealistic. But when we get to 23 and 24 and sure as hell 2025, we better start seeing some progress from this team. Like, this better be a team competing for the playoffs regularly, consistently. Didn't feel right.
No, it made sense.
I feel like too many LYs in a row. Otherwise, heads need to roll. You just don't get as much time to rebuild in this sport as you do in other sports. If you don't turn things around quickly, you have to make some moves. So once again, it doesn't need to take place this year. I don't think it's realistic to expect this to take place this year, but you got to see some linear progression from this team. And if you don't, guys are going to have to lose their jobs.
My response to, hey, the timeline, things like that is, if it doesn't work, like, you better find some damn good excuses as to why it's not working. And you better not be the person that made that decision. Like, if it's not working for the Houston Texans in a couple of years, the excuse better not be the head coach, because Nick Caserio hired him.
Yeah, the excuse can't be, well, we hired Josh McCown, so we knew it would take a couple of years for him to really learn how to be a head coach. Then don't hire the guy.
Yeah.
Hire Brian Flores, who's proven he could be a good coach.
Here's another thing that I think is really important when you look at the landscape of the National Football League and how the Bengals making it really changes a lot of teams' perception of where they are as an organization. This is a historically very cheap franchise. This is a franchise that does not have a luxurious stadium. It does not have the latest and greatest when it comes to taking care of their players and the training facility and this and that. Heck, James Harrison was diming them out in the offseason for serving stadium food as the player's meal, like literally what they sell at the concession stands for the player's meal.
Yeah, I lost a lot of respect for James Harrison that day because that food's incredible.
Sure.
I'll be bashing stadium food like that.
So I got to imagine owners that spend a tremendous amount of money on the organization that do have teams with the latest and greatest are looking at their guys like, hey, you better come up with some excuses that make sense quick, or I'll start writing the check to somebody else to figure this thing out.
Ultimately, they better get this hire right if you're the Texans, because you have Davis Mills, you find out what he is, then maybe you get one more crack at drafting a quarterback if you're Caserio, and that's it. You miss on that, you're gone.
Hey, Joe Burrow, year 2 in the Super Bowl. Davis Mills, year 2 coming up in 2022. What do we expect, boys?
Damn sure not the Super Bowl.
Oh, Joe Burrow about to be the 6th quarterback in the last 20 years to make it to a Super Bowl in his 2nd season as a starter.
How about double the win total?
Come on now.
Double your win total. Win 8 games next year if you're the Texans. And then that will show me a lot if you're Davis Mills. There's someone on the text line real quick that's trying to say that, oh, Burrow had a QBR of 86.5 and Jimmy G's QBR was 87. So give me a break trying to compare Burrow's greatness to Garoppolo when we were talking about the rebuild timeline.
Don't be a box score bozo, man. Watch the damn game.
I know. What a clown text by this guy. Joe Burrow threw for 250 yards and 2 touchdowns and led multiple game-winning drives in this playoff run. Jimmy Garoppolo has been a passenger who completed yesterday 16 of 30 pass attempts and had negative 3 yards over the final 2 drives of the game. I mean, what a joke comparing Burrow to Garoppolo. It's not even close.
Box score bozo, man. Come on.
Coming up, Tom Brady, the GOAT. Is he retiring, or is this all a giant sham for him to sell more crypto?